wanted to take a few minutes, especially for my online students, to record a sample problem. This is going to be for Chapter 3, Interdependence and Gains from Trade. I'm going to walk through a PPF, kind of a classic or typical PPF problem that you might expect to see on a homework or on an exam. And so those of you who have my face-to-face classes have already seen this in a lecture, but in case you were absent or you're one of my online students, I'm hoping this is helpful for you. So the first problem I'm going to work out is one about Iowa and Nebraska, and we're given a PPF that shows their production possibilities, frontiers. So, and this is assumed to be for one growing season. So in one growing season, Iowa can produce 45 bushels of soybeans, or if they concentrate all their resources on the production of corn, they can make 30 bushels of corn. So this is demonstrating the trade-off between soybeans and corn they face. They can either use all their resources to make soybeans and end up here on their PPF, or they can use all their resources on corn and end up down here at this endpoint, or they can have, of course, any combination along this PPF line. Or just as a quick review for you guys, anywhere inside here is also a possibility for Iowa. So they could just make 15 bushels of corn and 20 bushels of soybeans, but we would consider that to be inefficient because they would be not utilizing all their resources, not maximizing their production. Okay, and then we have something similar for Nebraska. Nebraska can either concentrate all their resources and get 80 bushels of soybeans, or if they concentrate all their resources on corn production, they will end up with 40 bushels, or some combination of the two along this line. So those are the two production possibility frontiers. And so I want to answer these 4 questions in this video. Who has the absolute advantage in corn? Who has the absolute advantage in soybeans? Who has the comparative advantage in corn? Who has the comparative advantage in soybeans? So whenever you see AA, I'm referring to absolute advantage. CA is comparative advantage. So the absolute advantage questions are pretty straightforward. You don't need to do any calculations. You just need to look at the endpoints of your PPFs to determine. So if we look at corn, we see that Iowa can produce 30 bushels of corn, while Nebraska can produce 40 bushels of corn. And so absolute advantage just means you can make more of a good using the same amount of resources, or another way to say it is you can make the same amount of the good using fewer resources. I always just say, I think of it as you're better at making the good. You're more efficient, you're more productive, whatever it is, you make more of it. So when we're comparing these two endpoints, whichever one is greater indicates to us who has the absolute advantage. So in this case, Nebraska can make more corn given their resources than Iowa can. So we would say Nebraska has the absolute advantage in corn. So let me type that. I'm still getting used to this whiteboard program, so there may be some hesitations in this video. So Nebraska would be the answer to who has the absolute advantage in corn. I'm going to change the color so that you can tell the difference between my answers and the question. Okay, so Nebraska, and again, the reason was because they can make 40 bushels of corn and Iowa can only make 30. Okay, now if we can do the same thing for soybeans. So for soybeans, I see that if Iowa concentrates all their efforts on making soybeans, they're going to end up with 45 bushels of soybeans. And if Nebraska concentrates all their efforts on soybeans, they're going to end up with 80 bushels of soybeans. So we see that Nebraska can make more soybeans in one growing season than Iowa can. 80 is greater than 45. So the answer for who has the absolute advantage in soybeans would also be Nebraska. So this brings up kind of an important point, which is that when we're talking about absolute advantage, remember that's the one where it's just kind of saying who's better at making the good or who can make more of the good. You can have the absolute advantage in both goods, as in this case, Nebraska has it in both corn and soybeans. You can have it in only one of the goods, or you can have it in neither of the goods. So Iowa has the absolute advantage in neither soybeans nor corn. So it's absolute advantage. It's not a relative comparison as with comparative advantage. And so we just need to remember that the answer for who has the absolute advantage in a good can be both. You can have it in both goods, you can have it in one of the goods, or you may not have it in any of the goods. Another case you'll see is where two economies could produce exactly the same amount of corn or soybeans. So if Iowa could also produce 40 bushels like Nebraska, so if both of these endpoints down here would have been 40, then we would say neither economy or neither state or country or whatever we're talking about has the absolute advantage. So it's possible for the answer to be neither economy has the absolute advantage if they can both make the same amount. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so moving on to the more interesting, more relevant, and more applicable calculation or determination. Let's talk about who has the comparative advantage in which good. So comparative advantage, the definition of it is that you have the lower opportunity cost of making a good. So to determine who has the comparative advantage, you have to first make a calculation of opportunity cost. And as a review, opportunity cost is what you give up in order to obtain units of a good. So in this example, where we're dealing with two goods, corn and soybeans, we're going to talk about the opportunity cost of corn in terms of soybeans. It's always in terms of the opposite good that you're dealing with. The reason for that is because in order to move, let's say Iowa is operating up here at this endpoint where they're making no corn and 45 bushels of soybeans. Well, in order to gain some units of corn, that is to move downward along this PPF, let's say they want to go from this endpoint all the way down to this endpoint, they have to give up some of the soybeans that they were producing in order to move towards producing corn. So I always just look at the endpoints. In this class, that will always be sufficient. So I always just say, okay, if Iowa gives up 45 bushels of soybeans, that is, they move from up here down to here, they can now gain 30 bushels of corn. So they give up 45 bushels of soybeans, and they can gain 30 bushels of corn. So the cost of making 30 bushels of corn is 45 bushels of soybeans. That's the trade-off. That's what they have to give up in order to make corn. So whenever you do an opportunity cost calculation, the opposite good is going to be on top. So it's going to look like this. I want to calculate the opportunity cost of corn for Iowa, or Iowa's opportunity cost of corn might have been a better way to say it. Iowa's opportunity cost of corn. I am going to, I'll do this over here for now. Maybe make it a little smaller so we have more room. Iowa's opportunity cost of corn is going to be, let's see if I can draw here with this pen. It's a little difficult. Okay, no, my pen is not currently working, so I will just type it instead. Okay, their opportunity cost of corn is going to be in terms of soybeans. So I'm going to look at the endpoint on Iowa's PPF and I see the 45 bushels of soybeans. That's what they're giving up to gain some corn. So they give up 45 bushels of soybeans per 30 bushels of corn that they gain. So on the bottom, I'm going to put 30 bushels of corn. Okay, and then I'm going to draw a line just to denote that we're dividing here. So 45 bushels of soybeans divided by 30 bushels of corn. So in math, when you have a fraction, this divider line, which I have yet to remember the name of, I really need to look that up. This little line represents per. You can replace it when you're speaking with the word per. So this is reflecting that Iowa gives up 45 bushels of soybeans per 30 bushels of corn that it produces. So again, that's 45 bushels of soybean per 30 bushels of corn. That's the cost of producing corn. They have to give up this many soybeans to make corn. Okay, so if we put that into a calculator, or if you're just good at mental math, it reduces to 3 over 2 or 1.5. 1.5. So 45 divided by 30 is equal to 1.5. And the units is bushels of soybeans per bushel of corn. Okay, so I'm gonna make that a little smaller. Oops. Okay. Sorry, bear with me as I get used to this program. Okay, so that's my opportunity cost for Iowa of corn, 1.5 bushels of soybeans per bushel of corn. Okay, now I can do the same thing for Nebraska. So if I want to find Nebraska's opportunity cost of corn, it's also going to be given in terms of bushels of soybeans, because in order to make corn, they're giving up soybeans. That's the trade-off they're facing. Okay, well, I look at Nebraska's PPF and I see that Nebraska has to give up 80 bushels of soybeans. So remember, you're always looking at the endpoints, these little endpoints. 80 bushels of soybeans, and by doing so, they gain 40 bushels of corn. So they give up 80 bushels in order to gain 40 bushels of corn. So that's going to look like 80 bushels of soybeans divided by, so I'll do a little line, 40 bushels of corn. Bushels of corn. Okay, and so that 80 divided by 40 is equal to 2. And again, the units are bushels of soybeans per bushel of corn. Okay, so now I've calculated the opportunity cost of corn for both states. Iowa's is 1.5. and Nebraska's is 2 bushels of soybeans. So to determine who has the comparative advantage, remember that's the original question, we're trying to determine who has the comparative advantage in corn. Once I have these calculations, all I have to do is see which one is lower. So 1.5 is lower than 2. So this state, Iowa, this is the lowest or lower opportunity cost. So Iowa would be said to have the comparative advantage in corn because their opportunity cost of 1.5 is lower than Nebraska's opportunity cost of 2. So whoever has the lower opportunity cost is who has the comparative advantage. So the answer to the question, who has the comparative advantage in corn, would be Iowa. Iowa has the comparative advantage in corn. And I'll just make a note because their opportunity cost of corn is lower than Nebraska's. Okay, so that's the answer to who has the comparative advantage in corn. Now let's talk about soybeans. So I am going to work out the calculation for opportunity cost in soybeans. Now, this is going to be in units of corn, because in order to make more soybeans, they would be giving up some corn. So we're basically going to, not basically, we are just flipping our calculations for the opportunity of corn upside down. So it's going to be the inverse of what the opportunity cost of corn was, because instead of bushels of soybeans over bushels of corn, we're going to have bushels of corn over bushels of soybeans. So that's something you can remember when you're kind of want to check your answers and make sure you're doing the right thing. Your opportunity cost of corn should be the inverse of the opportunity cost of soybeans. It should just be flipped upside down. Okay, so you don't have to remember that. You can always just do the straightforward calculating. So Iowa's opportunity cost of soybeans is going to look like, okay, in order to get soybeans, they're giving up corn, and they're giving up 30 bushels of corn, because I'm looking at the endpoint, 30 bushels of corn to gain 45 bushels of soybeans. 30 bushels of corn per 45 bushels of soybeans. So 30 bushels of corn. Oops, I forgot to change my color back. Oh well. 30 bushels of corn per 45 bushels soybeans. Okay, so 30 divided by 45 comes out to 0.67. 0.67. Okay, so Iowa's opportunity cost of soybeans is 0.67. Let me see if I can move this first. Here we go. Equals 0.67 bushels of corn per bushel of soybeans. Okay, so Iowa's opportunity cost of soybeans is 0.67 bushels of corn per bushels of soybeans. Now let's figure out Nebraska's opportunity cost, because we want to compare the two. So Nebraska's opportunity cost of soybeans. I will go and look at Nebraska's PPF, just this one on the right, and I see that they give up 40 bushels of corn in order to gain 80 bushels of soybeans. So I'm going to have 40 bushels of corn on top. And I'm going to have 80 bushels of soybeans on the bottom. Oops. So 40 over 80 gives me 1/2, or 0.5 bushels of corn per soybean. 0.5 bushels of corn per bushel of soybeans. Oops. Okay, so that's my opportunity cost for Nebraska of making soybeans. Okay, so whose is lower for soybeans? Iowa's opportunity cost, let's get a new color going. Iowa's opportunity cost of soybeans was 0.67. Nebraska's is 0.5. So Nebraska's 0.5 is lower than Iowa's 0.67. Therefore, Nebraska, having the lower opportunity cost in soybeans, has the comparative advantage in soybeans. So over here I would write Nebraska has the comparative advantage in soybeans because the opportunity cost for Nebraska of soybeans is lower than Iowa's. Okay, so a couple things I want to note. So that's the basic process of determining comparative advantage. You want to calculate the opportunity cost for both economies, compare them, determines whose is lower, and then whoever's is lower, they're the ones who have the comparative advantage. Okay, now an extension of that is to remember the principle of comparative advantage. So let me just zoom out here and start a new section where I write principle of comparative advantage, which says that a producer should specialize in whichever good that my grammar, I'm not sure how to word this grammatically. A producer should specialize in whichever good they have the comparative advantage in. I'm just ignoring the grammar. Okay, so this is an important principle to remember. Producers should specialize in whichever good they have the comparative advantage in. So going back up here, Iowa had the comparative advantage in corn. That means that they should specialize in corn. That's what this principle is telling us. Since Iowa has the comparative advantage in corn, they should specialize in corn. It's cheaper, relatively cheaper for them to produce corn than it is for Nebraska because they give up less. Their opportunity cost is less of doing so. So just to summarize, since Iowa has the comparative advantage in corn, they should specialize in corn. So you might see me ask, in addition to asking who has the comparative advantage, I might ask who will specialize in corn, or who should specialize in corn, who should specialize in soybeans, that kind of thing. So since Nebraska has the comparative advantage in soybeans, they should specialize in soybeans. Okay. All right, so once you know the opportunity costs of each economy, then you can determine who has the comparative advantage. And once you know the comparative advantage, you know what they should specialize in. A couple other things I want to note is that, remember we said for absolute advantage, an economy can have the absolute advantage in both goods, one good, or neither good. Well, it's different with comparative advantage. With comparative advantage, they can only have the comparative advantage in one good. So Iowa, since it has the comparative advantage in corn, they could not have it in soybeans. So a kind of shortcut you could take on these problems is, once you've calculated, say, the opportunity cost of corn, and you've determined that Iowa has the comparative advantage in corn, you could jump to the conclusion that since Iowa has it in corn, it must be true that the other producer, in this case Nebraska, has the comparative advantage in soybeans. So you could kind of skip this second set of calculations if you wanted, and know that if they have the comparative advantage in one, then they're not going to have it in the other. That will always be true because this is a relative calculation. So if they have the advantage in one, they won't have it in the other. So you're welcome to take that shortcut if it helps you save time on an assignment. Just make sure you understand why that's true. It's true because, going back to these calculations, the opportunity cost of corn is just the inverse of soybeans. So if we just flip these fractions upside down, then the results are just going to be flipped. So whoever had a higher opportunity cost of 1, once we flip them upside down, that will become the lower fraction, the smaller fraction, and they will have the lower opportunity cost in the other good. So just remember, a producer can only have the comparative advantage in one good, not both. Okay, now there is this theoretical possibility that you do your calculations for opportunity cost and they're equal. What would happen if Iowa's opportunity cost of corn was 1.5 and Nebraska's opportunity cost of corn was also 1.5? Okay, that's kind of a rare exception where you would say neither economy has the comparative advantage. Their opportunity costs are equal, so it costs them the same to produce the good. It's unlikely that you would see one of those in my class, but it is a possibility. So if their opportunity costs were equal, we would say neither has the comparative advantage. But in my class, most of the time, they're going to be different numbers, so you're going to say whoever has the lower opportunity cost has a comparative advantage. Okay, so I think that's all for this video. I'm going to do one more of these PPF or production possibilities examples, and in that one I'm going to show how you can also use this PPF model not only to determine who has the comparative advantage, but also to demonstrate the gains from trade. So one of the usages of this model for economists is to demonstrate graphically or numerically that trade benefits everyone, or trade benefits both parties. That was one of our early principles we talked about in chapter 1. We said that everybody can benefit from trade. So this model is one way of showing that. So in the next video, I will show you how you can see the gains from trade using these PPF models.